Jackson Carter had once been the kind of man whose presence silenced a boardroom, but after the accident, his motionless legs turned a Chicago penthouse into a prison. He dismissed his nurses, refused therapy, and quietly prepared to disappear from the company he had built with his own hands. Then one rainy afternoon, Grace, the therapist assigned to his recovery, was forced to bring her young daughter along for a few borrowed minutes. The girl never asked why he could not stand. She simply placed a paper crane into his hand and said, "Keep this safe." Jackson went completely still. If one small gift could save a life, stay and discover whether Jackson keeps surrendering or finally chooses to rise. 8 months after the crash, Jackson Carter had almost vanished from the world he once ruled. He lived alone in a penthouse high above Chicago, surrounded by furniture chosen for people who no longer visited. The skyline outside his window was beautiful in a way that felt distant, like something borrowed rather than owned. Inside, the walls told a different story, one lined with business awards, magazine covers, and framed patents that no longer matched the man who looked at them. He avoided mirrors more than he avoided people, though lately he avoided both. The apartment had become less a home and more a waiting room for a life he wasn't sure he wanted back. Jackson had not set foot inside Carter Meridian Technologies in months. He still answered emails from a laptop propped on his bed, still approved budgets and read reports. But the version of him doing that work felt like a ghost operating machinery from behind a curtain. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped correcting people who spoke about the company's future without mentioning his place in it. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself a lot of things that summer that weren't quite true. Quietly, without announcing it to anyone, he had begun drafting the paperwork that would transfer control of the company he founded to someone else entirely, treating the decision less like a defeat and more like an inevitable conclusion he was simply the last person to accept. Lucas Wyatt called almost daily, always warm, always reasonable, always insisting he only wanted Jackson to rest and heal without the burden of daily decisions. Jackson believed him at first, the way a person believes an old friend simply because the friendship is old. But behind those calls, Lucas was steadily building support among board members for a vote that would decide whether Jackson remained chief executive at all. The date was set for 30 days out, though nobody framed it to Jackson quite that plainly. Grace Madison arrived that week as the third physical therapist assigned to his case, and the first two had already quit or been dismissed before finishing a single month. She knocked once, entered without waiting for permission, and set her bag down like she intended to stay regardless of what he said next. Jackson watched her from his wheelchair near the window, arms crossed, already composing the sentence that would send her away like the others. She was in her late 30s, dressed plainly, with the steady posture of someone who had spent years standing beside other people's worst days without letting it show on her face. Nothing about her suggested she had come to be impressed by his reputation or intimidated by the size of his apartment. "You can't fix something that's already broken," he said, flat and final, the words meant to end the conversation before it began. Grace didn't flinch, didn't soften her voice into the careful tone people used around him now. She simply set a folder on the table, unhurried, as if his warning carried no more weight than the weather outside. "I'm not here to fix you," she said. For the first time in months, Jackson didn't have a ready answer. Grace never treated Jackson like someone to be pitied, and that alone set her apart from everyone else who had walked through his door since the accident. She built small, concrete goals instead of vague promises about recovery. The first target was simple: move from the bed to the wheelchair without assistance and without risking a fall. After that came upper body strength, pain management that didn't rely on him gritting his teeth through it, and the slow, unglamorous work of relearning independence in a body that no longer answered every command the way it used to. Jackson resisted nearly everything she suggested. He skipped exercises when she wasn't watching, argued about schedules, and made it clear more than once that he considered the sessions a formality rather than a path forward. Grace absorbed the resistance without taking it personally, the way a person handles weather rather than an insult. One rainy afternoon, a scheduling failure on Grace's end left her without a sitter for her daughter, Ella, who was 9 years old and used to waiting quietly in places that weren't built for children. Grace had no choice but to bring her along for a handful of minutes before a relative could arrive to collect her. This was one of the very few times Ella would appear in the story at all. While she waited, Ella sat in the reception area near the window, pulled a spare sheet of paper from her backpack, and folded it into the shape of a small crane, the kind of habit she carried from a school project she liked more than most of her classes. Jackson passed through the room in his wheelchair on his way back from another failed attempt at a transfer exercise, irritated and short on patience. Ella looked up at him, but her eyes never dropped to his legs the way most adults did. She didn't ask about the accident. She showed no trace of the careful, performed sympathy he had grown to dread. Before her mother came to collect her, Ella walked over and set the paper crane on the edge of his desk without ceremony, the way a child hands over something small and unremarkable to them but meant with complete sincerity. "What's that for?" Jackson asked, more out of confusion than curiosity. "So you can keep it," Ella said simply, already turning to gather her things. Grace appeared a moment later and guided her daughter out quickly, offering Jackson a brief, apologetic nod before the door closed behind them. The whole exchange lasted less than 2 minutes, forgettable to almost anyone who might have witnessed it. But Jackson didn't sleep that night. He kept looking at the small paper crane sitting on his desk under the lamp, turning it slightly in the light as though it might explain itself. Along the underside of one folded wing in a child's careful handwriting were 3 words, "One more day." He considered throwing it away more than once, telling himself the sentiment meant nothing, that it was just a scrap of paper folded by a bored child. Instead, before he finally turned off the light, he reached over and set it on the nightstand beside his bed, close enough to see the moment he woke up. Grace arrived the next morning expecting the usual argument and instead found Jackson already dressed and positioned near the mat, waiting for the session to begin. Nothing about him had transformed overnight. He was still sharp with his words, still visibly in pain during the harder movements, still resentful of the wheelchair sitting beside him like an unwanted companion. But he had agreed silently to try for one more day, and for the first time that felt like something rather than nothing. Over the following sessions, Grace began to understand that Jackson's despair wasn't rooted only in the loss of movement in his legs. It ran deeper than that, into a belief that had settled into him slowly and completely, that he had lost his value entirely, not just his ability to walk into a room the way he used to. He admitted, almost by accident, that before the accident his entire identity had been built around control, speed, and the certainty that he could handle anything faster and better than the people around him. Now he needed help with tasks so small they embarrassed him more than the accident itself ever had, and each request for assistance felt like another small confirmation that the man he used to be was gone for good. Grace pushed back gently against that idea, refusing to let it stand unchallenged. "Losing the ability to do one thing doesn't mean you lose the right to decide who you are," she told him, not as encouragement but as something closer to fact. Something between them began to shift after that, not into romance, not yet, but into a kind of mutual respect neither of them had expected. Jackson stopped bracing for her arrival like an intrusion. Grace stopped treating him like a difficult case file and started treating him like a person working through something enormous at his own pace. Their sessions still had structure, still had targets and repetitions and careful notes in a folder Grace carried from visit to visit, but the silence between exercises no longer felt hostile the way it once had. Meanwhile, Lucas continued calling with updates that always sounded reasonable on the surface. He mentioned, almost in passing, that the board's patience was wearing thin and that Jackson could join the upcoming meeting to discuss the company's direction, even if only by video from his apartment. Jackson refused every time, unwilling to sit in front of people he used to command and appear less than he had been. Lucas offered what sounded like comfort during one of these calls, his voice gentle in a way that felt almost rehearsed. "Maybe this is the moment to let the company move forward without you carrying the weight of it," he said. After the call ended, Jackson sat with the phone in his lap for a long time, saying nothing. His eyes drifted to the paper crane still resting on the nightstand, its folded wings slightly crooked from where he'd turned it over too many times. For the first time, a small, uncomfortable realization surfaced in his mind. In all the months of calls and updates and careful reassurances, Lucas had never once asked whether Jackson actually wanted to come back. In the weeks that followed, Jackson began joining a handful of company meetings remotely, at first only to listen, then slowly to ask questions again. What he found unsettled him more than he expected. Several decisions moving through Carter Meridian felt off in ways that were hard to name at first, but impossible to ignore once he started paying attention. One in particular stood out. Lucas was pushing forward a sale of a key research division at a price that made little sense for a unit that valuable. Jackson asked for the underlying documents, the financial models, the correspondence with the buyer, expecting the kind of quick turnaround he used to demand as a matter of habit. Instead, Lucas offered delays dressed up as reasonable explanations, one excuse folding neatly into the next. Every conversation ended with a promise that the paperwork was coming soon, and every promise quietly failed to materialize until the pattern itself became the loudest signal that something underneath the surface didn't add up. Grace stayed entirely outside the corporate side of things. She had no interest in company politics and made that clear whenever Jackson tried to vent about it during their sessions, gently steering him back toward the exercises in front of him. But she noticed something important all the same. Every time Jackson focused on solving a real problem, something with actual stakes and consequences, his entire posture changed, his voice sharpened, and the exhaustion that usually clung to him seemed to lift for a while. He began training harder after that, though not for the reason anyone might have expected. It wasn't about the fantasy of walking again unassisted, wasn't about proving anything to a mirror or an audience. It was about reclaiming something more basic than that. The ability to make decisions about his own life without needing anyone's permission first. Grace noticed the shift and adjusted the sessions accordingly, giving him more challenging work without ever asking what had changed his mind, sensing correctly that the answer belonged to him alone for now. Not long after, an old email surfaced in a routine document search tied to the vehicle involved in the crash the night of his accident. The car had belonged to the company's executive fleet, maintained under a standard service contract that Jackson had never personally reviewed line by line. Buried in the maintenance history was a report filed weeks before the crash, flagging a fault in the electronic braking system that required immediate attention. Jackson had never seen that report. He read it twice, certain he had misunderstood something, before reading it a third time to confirm he hadn't. The name attached to the approval that delayed the repair indefinitely was not unfamiliar to him at all: Lucas Wyatt. Jackson sat perfectly still for a long moment, the laptop screen glowing in an otherwise dark room, the paper crane visible at the edge of his vision on the nightstand nearby. What had started as a story about healing quietly shifted into something else entirely, a question he couldn't unask once it had formed. Had the accident simply been carelessness, an unfortunate failure buried under paperwork and bad luck? Or had someone known the danger and chosen, deliberately, to look away from it? In the days that followed, Jackson became consumed by a new kind of urgency, one that had less to do with healing and more to do with proving something to people who hadn't even asked him to. He pushed his training past reasonable limits, convinced that if he could just walk, even briefly, into the boardroom on his own two legs, the board would finally see him the way they used to, and Lucas would lose whatever advantage he had been quietly building. Grace noticed the shift almost immediately, and tried to slow him down before the pattern hardened into something dangerous. She had seen this before in other patients, the desperate rush toward a milestone that mattered more for what it symbolized than what it actually accomplished. Pushing too hard too fast rarely produced the outcome people imagined, and far more often it produced setbacks that cost weeks of progress in exchange for a single afternoon of false hope. Jackson didn't want to hear it. "If I walk into that room in a wheelchair, Lucas already won," he snapped, frustration bleeding into every word. Grace held her ground without raising her voice. "If you believe that, Lucas won 8 months ago," she said. It was the first real conflict between them, sharper and more personal than any disagreement they'd had before. Jackson told her coldly that he no longer needed her there. Grace didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't try to talk him out of the decision the way someone less sure of herself might have. She simply gathered her things and left without drama, without a parting speech meant to guilt him into changing his mind. Before she walked out, she set his updated recovery plan on the table beside the paper crane, the pages neatly organized despite everything that had just happened between them. That night, alone and unable to sleep, Jackson finally sat down and read through the full accident file himself, page by page, instead of skimming the summaries he'd been given before. What he found was worse in some ways than a conspiracy would have been, because it was so ordinary. Lucas hadn't caused the crash on purpose. He had known about the mechanical fault in the braking system and delayed the repair to avoid disrupting a tight production and travel schedule that mattered more to him than the risk attached to it. After the accident, rather than come forward, Lucas had spent months quietly burying the maintenance report deeper within the company's records, protecting his own career instead of admitting what his decision had cost. Jackson sat with that truth for a long time, feeling something colder than anger settle into his chest. The crash hadn't been an assassination attempt or some elaborate scheme. It was the far more common story of ambition, carelessness, and a cover-up that grew more elaborate the longer it went unchallenged. He thought about the months he had spent blaming only himself, treating the accident as a random cruelty rather than the direct consequence of a decision someone else had made and then chosen to hide. And now, with Jackson still recovering, still vulnerable, still absent from the company for months at a time, Lucas was using that same tragedy as leverage to finish tightening his grip on Carter Meridian for good. The next morning, Jackson called Grace before he had even finished getting dressed. He didn't apologize the way people usually do, with excuses layered over regret. Instead, he said something simpler and more honest than anything he'd told her before. "I want to learn how to live like this and still be myself," he said. Grace agreed to come back, and both of them understood, without saying it directly, that this was the real turning point in his recovery, more significant than any single exercise or milestone that had come before it. The goal was no longer to prove something to a room full of people who barely knew him. It was to build a version of himself he could actually recognize when he looked in a mirror, one that didn't depend on standing to feel whole. Jackson threw himself into the work differently this time. He practiced transferring in and out of the wheelchair until it became second nature, learned to operate an adapted vehicle with real confidence, and slowly, deliberately, began preparing to return to the company that still bore his name on the building. The day he finally walked, or rather rolled, back into Carter Meridian Technologies, the entire office seemed to hold its breath at once. He didn't hide the wheelchair behind a desk or angle himself to minimize how it looked. He didn't ask anyone to push him through the lobby, insisting instead on navigating it himself, unhurried, meeting the eyes of employees who clearly didn't know whether to greet him or look away. He wasn't trying to prove he could stand. He was simply present, fully and without apology, in a way he hadn't managed in months. Employees who had spent nearly a year hearing rumors about his condition now saw something entirely different from what they expected. A man who moved through the building with purpose rather than shame, who greeted people by name and asked about ongoing projects as though no time had been lost at all. Lucas met him in the lobby, his expression carefully composed to something that could have passed for warmth if you didn't look too closely. Jackson offered no small talk. "My office is still on the 42nd floor, isn't it?" he asked, already moving past him toward the elevators. From that day forward, Jackson began a quiet internal investigation of his own, working carefully and without alerting Lucas to how much he already understood. He gathered evidence showing that Lucas had suppressed the original maintenance report, pressured members of the safety team into staying silent, and used the months of Jackson's absence to push forward a deal that primarily benefited an investment group closely tied to Lucas himself. But Lucas didn't sit still once he realized Jackson was digging. He moved quickly to protect himself, pressing the board to schedule an early vote rather than wait for the timeline originally agreed upon. Jackson suddenly found himself with far less time than he had assumed he had. What had felt like a manageable window shrank overnight into something closer to a countdown, and every hour that passed meant fewer chances to gather the proof he needed before the decision was made without him. 48 hours remained before the board would decide, once and for all, whether Jackson Carter still had a place at the head of the company he had built from nothing. Lucas didn't attack Jackson through the accident itself. He was too careful for that and instead aimed directly at something harder to defend: Jackson's ability to lead it all. In a closed session with select board members, Lucas presented data showing that Carter Meridian had continued operating, and in some ways thriving, for months without Jackson present in any meaningful capacity. Revenue charts, project timelines, and quarterly comparisons filled the screen behind him, each slide reinforcing the same quiet suggestion without ever stating it outright, that the company's stability had come from someone other than the man whose name was still on the front door. "This was never about the wheelchair," Lucas said, his tone calm and measured in a way that made the words land harder. "This is about a chief executive who disappeared." What made the moment so difficult for Jackson wasn't that Lucas was lying. Part of what he said was uncomfortably true. Jackson had in fact withdrawn from his responsibilities for months, letting despair dictate decisions that affected hundreds of employees who depended on the company's stability. Charlotte Hayes didn't soften the situation when she spoke with him afterward. She told him plainly that the board would not keep him in place out of sympathy, no matter how sincere that sympathy might be, and no matter what he had been through since the crash. Charlotte had built her career on separating emotion from judgment, and she made it clear that Jackson would need to earn his seat back with evidence and results rather than history or goodwill. Jackson returned to the penthouse that evening, and for the first time admitted the truth to Grace without dressing it up in easier language. He wasn't afraid of losing the company itself. He was afraid that Lucas had proven conclusively that everyone around him was better off without him in the room. Grace didn't rush to contradict him or offer comfort that wasn't earned. She acknowledged that he had, in fact, given up for a period of time, that his absence had real consequences that couldn't simply be waved away with a good excuse. But giving up for 8 months, she told him, didn't mean he was obligated to give up for the rest of his life. People were allowed to fall apart for a while, she said, as long as falling apart wasn't the only thing they let themselves become. Jackson listened without interrupting, turning the words over slowly, letting them settle somewhere he hadn't let anything settle in a long time. The emotional distance between them had been narrowing for weeks, and that evening it closed a little further. In a quiet moment before an important meeting the next morning, Grace reached over and straightened his tie, her hands steady, her focus entirely on the small task in front of her. Neither of them spoke for a moment, both suddenly aware of how close they were standing. It wasn't a scene either of them had planned, and that made it feel more honest than anything either of them might have staged on purpose. There was no kiss, nothing dramatic or rehearsed about it. Jackson simply said quietly, "Thank you for never once feeling sorry for me." Grace looked at him and answered without hesitation, "I never had a reason to." The day of the vote finally arrived, and Lucas had assumed, without ever confirming it, that Jackson would join the meeting the way he had joined the others, by video, safely distant from the room where the decision would actually be made. Instead, the door to the boardroom opened, and Jackson entered on his own, moving through the room in his wheelchair without hesitation, without any of the shame he might have carried into that same space months earlier. There was no triumphant score playing in the background, no impossible moment of standing to prove a point that didn't need proving. The power of the moment came instead from the simple fact that Jackson no longer felt the need to apologize for how he moved through the world. Several board members exchanged glances as he took his place at the table, unsure how to reconcile the composed man in front of them with the rumors that had circulated for months about his absence and his state of mind. Lucas spoke first, delivering a polished, confident version of the argument he had rehearsed for weeks. Jackson didn't ask to keep his title. He addressed the board directly and admitted, without hedging, that he had disappeared for a period of time, that he had allowed his own despair to compromise responsibilities that hundreds of people depended on. If, after reviewing everything honestly, the board decided a change in leadership was necessary, he told them he would accept that outcome without resistance. But he asked them to base that decision on the full truth rather than a carefully curated version of events. He presented the maintenance records showing the ignored brake system warning, the internal emails documenting the delay, a detailed timeline connecting each decision to the person who made it, and statements gathered quietly from employees who had been pressured into silence. He laid each piece of evidence out in plain, unemotional language, letting the documents speak for themselves rather than dressing the presentation up with accusations the board could dismiss as personal grievance. Lucas's composure cracked for the first time since the meeting began. Jackson demonstrated methodically that Lucas had suppressed a known safety risk before the accident and then spent months afterward concealing his own role in what happened. More damaging still, Jackson showed that the deal Lucas had been pushing so aggressively carried a direct conflict of interest tied to investors closely connected to Lucas himself. The board voted to suspend Lucas immediately pending an independent investigation into everything Jackson had presented. Two members who had seemed firmly aligned with Lucas only minutes earlier now avoided his eyes entirely, their earlier confidence replaced by the careful stillness of people recalculating their own exposure. Still, Jackson had no idea whether the board intended to reinstate him fully or move forward with someone else entirely, and no amount of preparation could answer that question for him. He had told the truth, laid out every document without exaggeration, and now the outcome belonged to people whose decision he could influence but never control. Charlotte asked him to step outside while the board deliberated privately. The heavy doors closed behind him, leaving Jackson alone in the hallway with nothing but the sound of his own breathing and 8 months of uncertainty finally reaching its conclusion. Jackson waited in the hallway, the tension of the closed doors behind him pressing against every second that passed. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the paper crane, its folds softened and slightly worn from months of being carried and handled, and set down again in different rooms. He had brought it with him that morning without quite deciding to, tucking it into his pocket the way another man might carry a coin for luck, not because he believed in luck exactly, but because some habits form quietly and refuse to be examined too closely. This was the second time Ella would appear in the story in a way that actually mattered. Grace had just arrived after finishing her own workday, and Ella was with her for a short window of time before a relative would come to pick her up. The two of them happened to walk past the hallway where Jackson sat waiting. Ella spotted the crane in his hand immediately. "You still have it?" she asked, surprised in the plain, unguarded way only children manage. Jackson smiled, the expression coming easier than it had in a long time. "I do," he said. "Did it help you walk?" she asked next, tilting her head slightly as she studied him. Jackson looked down at the wheelchair, then back at her, choosing his words with more care than he usually managed these days. "No," he said. "It helped me want to keep going." Grace heard the exchange without saying anything herself, and no further explanation seemed necessary after that. Some things landed better without a word added on top of them. Ella left again shortly after, kept away from the deeper complications of the day, exactly as her presence in the story had been all along. Charlotte emerged from the boardroom a short while later, her expression giving nothing away as she crossed the hallway toward him. The board hadn't reinstated Jackson out of sympathy, and Charlotte made that clear before saying anything else. Sympathy, she reminded him, wasn't a currency the board dealt in, and it never had been. What had swayed the room, she said, was the evidence itself, laid out with a clarity that left no room for the board to look away from what Lucas had done or excuse it as an isolated lapse in judgment. Instead, they offered him a 6-month evaluation period, built around measurable competence, financial transparency, and consistent results rather than history or goodwill. The terms were stricter than anything Jackson had operated under before the accident, but he found he didn't resent the strictness the way an earlier version of himself might have. If anything, the clear expectations felt like after months of uncertainty with no defined edges at all. Jackson accepted without hesitation. He understood, in a way he hadn't fully grasped before that hallway conversation, that he wasn't simply reclaiming the life he'd had before the crash. Trying to rebuild that exact version of himself would have been its own kind of mistake, a refusal to acknowledge how much had actually changed. Instead, he was starting to build something new, shaped by everything the past 8 months had forced him to learn about himself, about the people around him, and about what actually mattered when the easy parts of his old life had been stripped away entirely. The company would recover its footing in time, but Jackson understood now that his own footing mattered just as much, and that neither one required him to become the exact man he used to be before a single distracted decision changed the course of his life. 1 year later, Carter Meridian Technologies had steadied itself well beyond the turbulence of that long and difficult season. Lucas had been removed from the company entirely and faced the appropriate legal consequences tied to concealing safety reports and violating his responsibilities as an executive, a resolution grounded in accountability rather than dramatic revenge. Jackson still relied on his wheelchair for most of his daily life. His recovery had brought some genuine neurological progress and short periods of supported standing, small gains that mattered enormously to him without ever tipping into the territory of a miracle cure. The real victory, the one that mattered most, was quieter than any physical milestone. Jackson had stopped measuring his own worth by whether or not he could walk. That single shift changed how he moved through every part of his life, from the boardroom to the smallest private moments no one else ever saw. He restructured Carter Meridian in the months that followed, giving the safety division far more authority than it had ever held before and establishing a fund to support rehabilitation costs for families who couldn't otherwise afford the kind of care that had once been offered to him. Employees who had watched the entire ordeal unfold in quiet fragments over the past year began to see the company differently too, less like a machine built purely for growth and more like something that finally remembered the people inside it. Grace didn't leave her profession to become known simply as the partner of a prominent executive. She continued her career exactly as she had built it, and only after the professional relationship between them had fully and formally ended did Jackson finally ask her to dinner. The romance that followed grew slowly, unfolding across many quiet months rather than arriving all at once. In the final scene, Jackson and Grace sat beside a window in a small, unremarkable restaurant overlooking the familiar Chicago skyline. There was nothing extravagant about the setting, no elaborate proposal waiting in the wings, nothing staged for effect. Grace reached into her bag and set a new paper crane down on the table in front of him, its folds crisp and freshly made. Jackson laughed softly. "What does this one say?" he asked. "Open it and find out," Grace said. Jackson carefully unfolded one wing. Inside, in her handwriting this time rather than her daughter's, were 3 simple words: "One more life." Jackson looked up at her, and this time he understood completely what the words meant. The first crane hadn't been the thing that made him stand. It had been the thing that made him want to live long enough to find his own reason to stand, on his own terms, in his own time. And as Jackson gently reached across the table and took Grace's hand in his, the story didn't end with a chief executive miraculously cured. It ended instead with a man who had finally fully stopped believing he needed to be healed in order to deserve a life worth living and someone worth loving beside him. Outside the window, the city moved on the way it always had, indifferent to any single life within it, and yet for Jackson, none of that indifference mattered anymore. What mattered was the small paper bird resting in his palm, proof of every hard day he had chosen to survive instead of surrender, and the woman across the table who had never once asked him to be anyone other than exactly who he already was.